This final chapter, Lives of the Dead, does a wonderful job of connecting all of the chapters we have read so far. I'm sure you have noticed that it does read like a connection of short stories that over time we start to piece together chronologically, but the story itself is not written chronologically. But this particular chapter really does tie everything up in a bow, sort of looking at Tim's life from the time he was young until the time when he's actually writing this book. So it begins by saying, "This too is true. Stories can save us. I'm 43 years old and a writer now, and even still right here, I keep dreaming Linda alive." Who is Linda? This is a new character. And Ted Lavender, and Kiowa, and Kurt Lemon, and a slim young man I killed, and an old man sprawled beside a pig pen, and several others whose bodies I once lifted and dumped into a truck. So we're going to get the details of some of these things we're not aware of. We know about Ted Lavender and Kurt and Kiowa. We don't know, well, we do know about the young man he killed, but we don't know about an old man sprawled beside a pig pen. We don't know about people he loaded into a truck, and we don't know about Linda. Start here, a body without a name. On an afternoon, in 1969, the platoon took sniper fire from a filthy little village along the South China Sea. Jimmy Cross ordered up an airstrike, which perhaps seemed unnecessary. For the next half hour, we watched the place burn. It was a cool, bright morning like early autumn. And afterwards, they head into the village to see about if there's any people alive still. And when they get there, they confirmed one old man who lay face up near a pig pen at the center of the village. So this is the man by the pig pen. His right arm was gone. His face had flies and gnats. Dave Jensen goes over and shakes the old man's hand. One by one, the others do it too. This is important to note. This is back to the beginning of the war. I was brand new to the war. It was my 4th day. He didn't have a sense of humor. Tim was not comfortable shaking the dead man's hand. And they sort of teased him. You know, Dave Jensen's like, "Go on, be polite, introduce yourself, show some respect for your elders." And Tim is like, "No way. Maybe it's too real for you." "That's right," I said, "way too real." Dave Jensen keeps after him, but he did not go near the body. It wasn't the old man's corpse so much as it was the fact of greeting the dead. An awesome fact. Like, awesome can have a very positive connotation, but, you know, this is very conflicting. Obviously, paying respect to somebody is an awesome thing to do, even when they're dead, especially when they're dead, just to remember them. Maybe not especially, but certainly when they're dead, to remember them. And so in that sense, it's awesome, but it's also awesomely horrible. Like, you just can't imagine doing this to this person who is so brutally killed. Mitchell Sanders said he was he's the guest of honor. He gives the guy oranges. So they like have this whole thing where they sit around this dead body and they talk to the dead body. And Tim really struggles with this. At the end of that, Kiowa pulls him away and says, "You did a good thing today. That shaking hands crap, it isn't decent." Of course, we know that Kiowa is the one who carries his Bible. He's respectful of the afterlife. He's respectful of churches. He's respectful of what's right and wrong. And Tim says, you know, it wasn't that I had guts to walk away from that. I was scared because Kiowa regrets the fact that he shook the corpse's hand. And Kiowa says, well, that's the same difference. You know, scared, guts is sort of interesting. But I couldn't do it, O'Brien says. And Kiowa says, well, I guess this was your first look at a real body. And he shakes his head. All day long, I'd been picturing Linda's face, the way she smiled. So now we're going to find out who Linda is. But that poor old man, he reminds me of, Tim says, my first date. Kiowa looked at me for a long while, and then he leaned back and smiled. That's a bad date. So now we're going to get the story of Linda, who was Tim's first date. They were only 9 years old. Linda was 9 then, as I was, and we were in love. And he talks about what this love felt like. It didn't feel like a crush or infatuation. He loves her, he says. He wanted to live inside her body. I wanted to melt into her bones. That kind of love. In 1956, they were in 4th grade, and he takes her on the first real date of his life, a double date with his parents, because of course he can't like go anywhere. And they go to a movie. And it's interesting and funny, really, to read about how awkward, as we all know, we were all 9 years old at one point, how awkward he is with her. He loves her so much, and he believes she loves him too, but they can hardly talk to each other. So he talks about how they're in the back seat of the car driving to the movie, and he talks about what she looks like and what he's thinking about her. And he remembers that she wore a new red cap, which seemed very stylish and sophisticated and unusual. It was a stocking cap. And of course, they live in Minnesota, so, it's cold. It's winter. And it had like a long tail, like what an elf would wear. And sitting in the back seat, he wanted to find some way to let her know how I felt, a compliment of some sort. And he says, "Geez, what a cap." So not even really sure that is a compliment. So again, just showing how awkward a 9-year-old boy can be. Linda smiled at the window. She knew what I meant, but my mother turned and gave me a hard look. It surprised me. It was as if I'd brought up some horrible secret. So I think that's a moment for pause and questioning. For the rest of the ride, I kept my mouth shut. He's like, well, gosh, I can't say anything right. They go in first to the movie theater, and then he sits next to Linda, and, he doesn't have like any idea what to say to her. He, kind of like fumbles around trying to find things to say. At the ticket booth, Linda stood off to the side, and I moved to the concession area. And instead of saying like something nice, like, "Can I get you some popcorn?" He says, "Hey, step it up. You want popcorn or what?" So he's just trying to be a cool guy. So this next section is repeating details we've already read. He says, the thing about a story is that you dream it as you tell it. So we are getting more things here about what a story does. And I think if anyone is writing about this or just trying to think about this through line about the importance of storytelling, this is another example of that. There is an illusion of aliveness. And then he talks about Ted Lavender with his habit of popping the tranquilizers and how he would talk about it was such a mellow war. And we've read this before. And then in April, he was shot in the head outside the village. Kiowa and I and a couple others were ordered to prepare his body. I remember squatting down, not wanting to look, but then looking. And then he describes what he looked like. Quickly, trying not to feel anything, we went through his pockets. I remember wishing I had gloves. So these are some new details about that moment. It wasn't the blood, it was the deadness. We put his personal effects in a plastic bag and tied the bag to his arm. We stripped off the canteens and the ammo. For a while, nobody said anything. And then they start talking again, like as if they're with him. Like, hey, it's such a mellow war. The chopper's going to come and take you, and it's going to be so cool. You're going to be relaxed, and talking about basically going to heaven. So this is a way of honoring him. So as much as it seems strange to talk to the dead man next to the pigsty, in this instance, it doesn't seem quite as strange because they're talking to Ted the way they used to, and it's a way of remembering and honoring him. We can almost see Ted Lavender's dreamy blue eyes. We could almost hear him. There was the sound of the wind, the sound of the birds. That's what a story does. The bodies are animated. You make the dead talk. They sometimes say things like Roger that, or they say, Timmy, stop crying, which is what Linda said to me after she was dead. Even now, I can see her walking down the aisle of the old State Theater in Worthington, Minnesota. I can see her face in profile beside me, the cheeks softly lighted by coming attraction. So he still remembers that moment, 30-ish years later, 31 years later. The movie that they're seeing with his parents is The Man Who Never Was. Now, I've never seen this movie. I've never heard of it. But he says, I remember the plot clearly because the main character was a corpse. Okay, so death is just everywhere. And I'm like, what? Who decided to take 4th graders to this movie? That fact alone deeply impressed me. It was a World War II film. The Allies have some scheme to mislead Germany out of the sight of the upcoming landings in Europe. They get their hands on a body, a British soldier, and they dress him up in an officer's uniform, plant fake documents in his pockets, and then dump him into the sea and let the currents wash him onto a Nazi beach. So the Germans would find the documents in the movie, and then because of that deception, it wins the war. So this is what the movie is about. He says, I can remember the awful splash of that when that corpse fell into the sea. Oh my God. I remember glancing over at Linda, thinking it might be too much for her, but in the dim gray light, she seemed to be smiling at the screen. And he talks about how she looked in that light. Even then, I kept seeing the soldier's body tumbling toward the water, splashing down hard, how inert and heavy it was, how completely dead. This is a traumatizing visual for a kid who's 9. It was a relief when the movie ended, I'll bet. Then they go to Dairy Queen at the edge of town. So death followed by ice cream. The night had a quilted, weighted down quality. All around us, Minnesota, prairies reaching out in long, repetitive waves of corn and soybeans. Everything is flat. Then he remembers taking Linda home. He must have said something, but he doesn't remember exactly what he said. He just remembers images like walking her to the front door, the brass porch light with its yellow glow, and just saying bye. Over the next few weeks, Linda wore her new red cap to school every day. She never took it off, not even in the classroom. So now we can infer that she has an illness. She has cancer, something that she has to cover her head because she's lost her hair. She took some teasing, and most of it came from a kid named Nick Veenhoff. On the playground, he would creep around and try and grab her cap. She always hangs onto it so that he can't get it. Tim says, naturally, I wanted to do something about it, but it just wasn't possible. I had my reputation to think about, and I think this could cause someone to turn up their nose a little bit. But remember, this is 4th grade. I had my pride, and there was also the problem of Nick Veenhoff. So he's a bully. He doesn't want to get mixed up with him, have him want revenge on him or something. So he's a bystander. He's paralyzed by his social concerns. I stood off to the side, just a spectator, wishing I could do the things I couldn't do. I watched Linda clamp down the cap with the palm of her hand. For me, it mattered. It still does. I should have stepped in. 4th grade is no excuse. He also says that maybe it would have been nice to have some practice being brave before he went off to war. Also, maybe if he'd been brave and tried to stop Nick, he could have stopped what happened next. So the next story is they're sitting in class taking a spelling test. We're going to get all of this described here. I'm just going to summarize it for you, where Nick asks to get up and sharpen his pencil. And he makes a big deal of it, limping up to the pencil sharpener, slowly sharpening the pencil. So he's just like stalling and distracting the class. He's being a class clown. And then on his way back to his desk, he grins at one of his friends, and already Tim knows what's coming. He goes past Linda's desk, drops the pencil, and squats down to get it. When he comes back up, his left hand slipped behind her back. There was a half-second hesitation. Maybe he was trying to stop himself. Maybe he felt some small approximation of guilt, but it wasn't enough. He took hold of the white tassel and lifted off her cap. Somebody laughed. Somebody said, "Oh." Even now, when I think back on it, I can still see the glossy whiteness of her scalp. So she was bald. Also at the back, there's a Band-Aid. There's a row of black stitches, a piece of gauze taped over her left ear. So she had a brain tumor. He was still smiling, Nick was, but the smile was doing strange things. I mean, what did he think? And Tim looks over at Linda, and they have this sort of silent conversation through their expressions where she sort of says, well, and he says, sure, okay, which there's no sense about whether this is a positive thing, whether this is a negative thing, but we know that they're locking eyes and that he's giving her some support in some way just by looking at her. She cries a little bit in class, and then after the end of that school day, both Nick and Tim walk her home, which I thought was interesting because this guy is such a jerk. It's now 1990. I'm 43 years old, which should have seemed impossible to a fourth grader. And yet when I look at photographs of myself as I was in 1956, I realize that in the important ways I haven't changed at all. This is true for all of us. I was Timmy then. Now I'm Tim, but the essence remains the same. I'm not fooled by the baggy pants or the crew cut or the happy smile. I know my own eyes, and there is no doubt that the Tim smiling at the camera is the Tim I am now. Inside the body or beyond the body, there is something absolute and unchanging. The human life is all one thing, like a blade tracing loops on ice, a little kid, a 23-year-old infantry sergeant, a middle-aged writer knowing guilt and sorrow. This is very important. This simile is going to come up again. As a writer now, I want to save Linda's life, not her body, her life. She died, of course, 9 years old, and she died. It was a brain tumor. She lived through the summer, and then she died that next fall in September. In a story, I can steal her soul. I can revive at least briefly that which is absolute and unchanging. In a story, miracles can happen. Linda can smile and sit up. She can reach out and touch my wrist and say, "Timmy, stop crying." He can feel connected to her through his imagination. At some point, I had come to understand that Linda was sick, maybe even dying, but I loved her and just couldn't accept it. He remembers in that summer talking to his mother and how she tried to explain to him that sometimes people have bad things that happen and they die. And he doesn't even accept that. You know, he still says, "But she'll get better." No, his mother says. And then he just says, "Well, not Linda." He can't imagine. Then, that's on a September afternoon during recess, Nick Veenhoff came up to me on the school playground. "Your girlfriend," he said, "she kicked the bucket." What? Oh my gosh. I mean, we hate this kid. You know, what kind of kid does that? Just, you know, glorifying, you know, like, I'm going to get to say something. I'm going to be the person to tell him so that I can see him squirm and see him be upset. And he even uses the phrase that some of the soldiers use, you know, phrases that don't really say, you know, in a deeper way what happened. At first, I didn't understand. And then he says, "She's dead. My mom told me at lunchtime. No lie. She actually kicked the goddamn bucket." All I could do was nod. It didn't register. He glances away, and then he walked home without telling anyone. This reminds me of him, without telling anyone, going to the Rainy River. It was a little after 1 o'clock, I remember, and the house was empty. I drank chocolate milk and then lay down. And he just started to think about her, trying to make her come back. He tried to will her alive. In a daydream, he was able to make that happen. He sees her in his daydream coming down the middle of Main Street alone. It's dark and deserted. He sees what she's wearing, what her hair looks like, all grown back, that the scars and the stitches are gone. In the dream, if that's what it was, she was playing a game of some sort, laughing and running on the empty street, kicking a big aluminum water bucket, kicking the bucket. Then he starts to cry. After a moment, Linda stops and carries her water bucket to the curb and says, and asks why he is so sad. And Tim says, "Well, you're dead." And Linda nodded. There was something ageless in her eyes, not a child or an adult, just a bright, ongoing everness, that same pinprick of absolute lasting light that I see today in my own eyes as Timmy smiles at Tim from the graying photographs of that time. So it's like the totality of herself, just like the totality of Tim, like that lives on in people's hearts, for sure. "Dead," I said. And then she says, "Timmy, stop crying. It doesn't matter." In Vietnam, too, we had ways of making the dead seem not quite so dead. So similar to this, shaking hands is one of them. So he realizes, obviously he didn't at the time when he'd only been in the war for 4 days, but looking back, he realizes that shaking hands with the dead or pretending to talk to Ted Lavender, it was very similar to what he did after Linda died when he imagined her back to life. Then he talks about something he had to do that was very difficult. This was also referenced in that first paragraph here, that, when he remembers like that we transform the bodies into piles of waste. This is what happens. Like they literally, like Kurt Lemon, his body was not really a body, but rather one small bit of waste in the midst of a much wider wastage. I learned that words make a difference. It's easier to cope with kick the bucket than corpse. So he understands like maybe why Nick Veenhoff made that comment or used those words. They would say things like crispy critter or roasted peanut when somebody had been burned by napalm. We kept the dead alive with stories, just like he does with Linda. He also did that with Ted Lavender. They talked about him. There were Christians among us like Kiowa who believed in the New Testament stories of life after death. Other stories were passed down like legends from old timers to newcomers. So like when a new person would show up in the company, they would tell stories to him about the people who they had lost. They also sort of make up stories that aren't true at all. They just remember Kurt Lemon and they pretend that he's going trick-or-treating. And then they sort of together create a whole story about how Kurt Lemon would go trick-or-treating on Halloween, because it's the kind of thing he would do, and it's a way of honoring his personality and feeling good about who he was. To listen to the story, especially as Rat Kiley told it, you'd never know that Kurt Lemon was dead. He was still out there in the dark, naked and painted up, trick-or-treating, sliding from hooch to hooch in that crazy white ghost mask, but he was dead. So this made-up story helps them for a moment just pretend he's alive, In the September after Linda died, I asked my father to take me to the funeral home to view the body. He's curious, but he also wants some sort of closure. He wants to see her, that she's actually gone. His father's unsure. He's like, are you sure about this? And Tim wasn't sure, but he really does feel the need to see her. When they get to the funeral home, his dad's like, no, if this bothers you, we'll just get out of there. You just let me know. Don't feel sick or anything. And Tim's like, I won't. Inside, the first thing he notices is the smell. The viewing room was empty except for Linda and my father and me. He feels a rush of panic as he walks up the aisle. He's thinking like he feels the same way he felt when he went up to her door to pick her up for the movie. Like he wants to impress her. He wants something to happen between them, a secret signal of some sort. Like he's still hoping to connect with her. The room was dimly lit. Linda's white casket was illuminated by a row of spotlights, and then his father steps away and leaves him by himself. It didn't seem real, a mistake. The girl lying in the white casket wasn't Linda. There was a resemblance, but the Linda that he remembers had been slender and fragile. But this body was fat and swollen. For a second, I wondered if somebody had made a terrible blunder in terms of how they embalmed her. How could she look like this? He sort of hopes that maybe she's going to jump out from behind the casket and laugh and say, oh, it's nothing, I'm still alive. But of course, that's not true. In my heart, I knew this was Linda, but even so, I couldn't find much to recognize. I tried to pretend she was taking a nap, but she didn't look asleep. She looked dead. She looked heavy and totally dead. I remember closing my eyes and then my father saying, let's go get some ice cream. In the months after Ted Lavender died, there were many other bodies, but I never shook hands. But one afternoon, I climbed a tree and threw down what was left of Kurt Lemon. I watched my friend Kiowa sink into the muck of the Song Trebong. And in early July, after a battle in the mountains, I was assigned to a 6-man detail to police up the enemy killed in actions. There were 27 bodies, so this is also referenced in that first paragraph of this chapter. We have not heard this story before. So they go up to this village and there are dead people everywhere. He says it was his worst day of the war. So if any teacher asks you what is the worst day of the war, it's the day he had to go collect 27 dead bodies from a place that they had attacked. For 3 hours, we carried the bodies down the mountain to a clearing. They had to swing the bodies up and throw them into the back of a truck. Because they had been dead for a while, they were bloated and they were making terrible sounds. And at some point, Mitchell Sanders says, "Hey man, I just realized something." He says, "Death sucks. Lying in bed at night, I made up elaborate stories to bring Linda alive in my sleep." So we're going back and forth from the war stories to his story as a child. "I invented my own dreams. It sounds impossible, but I did it. I'd picture someone's birthday and then pretend that she was there." So what he started to do, which is what's going to be described here, is go to bed earlier and earlier every night so that he could have these dreams, so he could lay in bed and just allow himself to imagine her in his life. "My dreams had become a secret meeting place." And his mother is like, "Why are you going to bed so early? What's wrong?" And he just says, "I just need extra sleep, that's all." But really, he doesn't want to lose Linda. He wants to stay connected to her in his imagination. He knew that she was dead, but already at 9 years old, I had begun to practice the magic of stories. So this is, he's becoming a writer in these moments. Others I wrote down, the scenes and dialogue, and at nighttime I'd slide into sleep knowing that Linda would be there waiting for me. Once I remember we went ice skating late at night, tracing loops and circles under the yellow floodlights. Okay, we had this image before. Later we sat by a wood stove in the warming house all alone, and after a while I asked her what it was like to be dead. Apparently Linda thought it was a silly question. She said, "Do I look dead?" I told her no. She looked terrific. I waited a moment. And then Linda made a little sigh. And she says, "Well, right now I'm not dead. But when I am, it's like, I don't know, I guess it's like being inside a book that nobody's reading." "A book?" I said. This could be a quiz question. "What is it like being dead?" "Like being inside a book that no one's reading." "An old one. It's up on the library shelf, so you're safe and everything. But the book hasn't been checked out for a long time. All you can do is wait. Just hope somebody will pick it up and start reading," which is kind of what he's doing when he imagines her. He's reading her book. "Anyhow, it's not bad," she said. "I mean, you're dead. You just have to be yourself." She stood up and put on her red stocking cap. "This is stupid. Let's go skate some more." So I followed her down to the frozen pond. It was late and nobody else was there, and we held hands and skated almost all night under the yellow lights. I am 43 years old and a writer now, still dreaming Linda alive in exactly the same way. She's not the embodied Linda. She's mostly made up with a new identity and a new name, like the man who never was. Her real name doesn't matter. She was 9 years old. I loved her and then she died. And yet right here in the spell of memory and imagination, I can still see her as if through ice, as if I'm gazing into some other world, a place where there are no brain tumors and no funeral homes, and there are no bodies at all. I see Kiowa too, and Ted Lavender and Kurt Lemon, and sometimes I can even see Timmy skating with Linda under the yellow floodlights. So this beautiful image suggests so many things to me. It suggests the connectedness we have throughout our life as a child, to our present selves, to our future selves. It reminds me of the circle of life, definitely too. It also just sort of opens the door to the idea of an afterlife, that there's something out there that continues on and on and on. I'm young and happy. I'll never die. I'm skimming across the surface of my own history, moving fast, riding the melt beneath the blades, doing loops and spins. And when I take a high leap into the dark and come down 30 years later, I realize it is as Tim, trying to save Timmy's life with a story. This just gives me goosebumps too. Isn't that just beautiful? So to continue this metaphor of skimming across the ice, you're moving through history, that your life has all this continuum, that you are who you are always. It's incredibly comforting, actually. We see here for sure that young Tim has been burdened by death for a long time. But isn't everyone burdened by death? Whenever it happens, it doesn't matter when the first time is that you experience death. It becomes a burden for the rest of your life. He knows that storytelling brings the dead back to life and makes them present in your world. And it helps you heal from your trauma and your loss. So that's what all of this book is about. Also, writing stories gives your own life more meaning. We definitely see that here in the end, because it's not just cathartic for him in the sense that he can, express his feelings and process what has happened, but it's a way for him to see his own soul, to see who he is and who he has always been.